instantly claiming central space. This opening volley aims to dictate the game's rhythm and unlock rapid piece development. French defense. This solidifies the center, preparing a robust pawn chain and potentially restricting white's knight development on the king side. Establishing central dominance immediately. White aims to seize the initiative by dictating the game's rhythm and restricting black's development. Challenging the center immediately, this pawn thrust creates dynamic tension and opens lines for piece development, setting the stage for an immediate strategic battle. Developing the knight to c3 immediately pressures the center and opens avenues for further piece activity. Initiating tactical skirmishes, black aims to disrupt white's developing pieces and exploit the central pawn structure. This advance injects immediate spatial pressure, cramping black's development and creating a foothold for further central dominion. Striking at the center, black challenges white's pawn chain and seeks counterplay by opening lines. Pushing that pawn forward immediately challenges black's bishop, forcing a decision about its future placement. Trading off a well-placed bishop for a knight disrupts white's pawn chain and frees black's queenside. Opening the b-file grants your rook immediate access to the center, but also creates a permanent structural weakness on the queenside that black will undoubtedly exploit. Developing the knight to e7, though seemingly passive, aims to solidify the center and prepare for queenside counterplay. Acknowledging white's pawn thrust has granted a spatial advantage. Pushing that pawn further establishes white's queenside space advantage, aiming to restrict black's pieces and potentially creating a passed pawn later on. Reclaiming the bishop's influence, this queen sortie initiates a dynamic counterthrust, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and exploit the open c-file. Securing the queen's position on this central diagonal hints at an intent to participate in the upcoming pawn structure skirmishes, potentially aiming to leverage the open b-file for later pressure. Re-establishing knight influence in the center, this maneuver aims to contest white's central space and prepare for potential pawn breaks, hinting at a desire to challenge the pawn chain's solidity. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces the central pawn chain, aiming to bolster white's central control and prepare for kingside castling. This piece repositioning subtly prepares for future pawn advances and aims to disrupt black's nascent queenside expansion by creating pressure on the c6 knight. Opening the central diagonal for the queen, this pawn grab immediately confronts the doubled pawns and challenges white's central control, potentially preparing for further piece activity by liberating the king's bishop. Reclaiming the center and opening the b-file, this recapture sets the stage for a dynamic central struggle, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns on the c-file and gain an advantage in pawn structure and open lines. Exchanging the queens now significantly alters the middle game's character, simplifying the immediate tactical landscape and steering the game towards a more strategic battleground. Black's decision to capture the queen effectively removes a potent attacking piece for white, but it also opens up the b-file for white's rook, a potential long-term advantage to consider. This trade creates a position where pawn structure weaknesses, particularly white's doubled c-pawns, might become more pronounced as the game progresses and pieces continue to be traded. Solidifying the pawn structure after the exchange on d2, white aims to develop pieces to active squares, potentially exploiting black's slightly awkward knight placement. Black boldly places the knight on the central outpost, creating a concrete target for white's pieces and initiating a fascinating positional struggle where control of the d-file will become paramount. This knight's presence on f5, while potentially vulnerable, dictates the immediate tactical landscape. Activating the bishop towards the center opens up avenues for an eventual kingside assault. Developing the bishop to this square prepares for castling kingside and connects the rooks, but it also creates a slight vulnerability on the c-file, which white's doubled pawns now control, so anticipate potential pressure there. Consolidating the bishop's influence on the kingside now, preparing for a potential queenside expansion and solidifying the central pawn structure. Asserting dominance over the open d-file is paramount now, as black strategically repositions their rook to contest this vital artery and potentially prepare for a d5 pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain space. Stepping the monarch forward now, the king ventures into the fray, a bold gambit to contest the central squares and potentially disrupt black's developing harmony. This proactive king placement signals an intent to participate actively in the unfolding drama, aiming to bolster piece coordination, and perhaps even spearhead an assault rather than passively observe from the sidelines. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, and by tucking the king away, black achieves immediate safety while connecting the rooks, a fundamental positional goal. This maneuver begins the transition into a playable middle game, shoring up a potential weakness. Gaining space on the queen side with this pawn thrust aims to restrict black's pieces, particularly the queen's knight, and potentially prepare a breakthrough later on. A purposeful repositioning of the rook, aiming to influence the c-file and potentially support a pawn advance later. Initiating a rook lift to the king's side to bolster the central pawn chain and potentially support a future kingside attack. Challenging the central pawn advance, f6 initiates a dynamic counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's imposing pawn chain and potentially open lines for black's pieces. This bold pawn thrust injects immediate tactical possibilities, forcing white to reconsider their spatial advantage and the safety of their king. Exchanges the bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and eliminating a key defender of the dark squares around black's king. This trade, however, does grant white a slight material advantage with two bishops against a knight and pawn, and opens up the c-file for their rook, potentially creating pressure on black's queen side. Consider if this simplification aligns with your strategic goals for the upcoming middle game, or if it prematurely leads into an endgame where the pawn structure might become a liability. The pawn structure has fundamentally shifted. By recapturing with the f-pawn, black opens the f-file for potential future action, albeit at the cost of a doubled pawn which limits mobility and creates potential weaknesses. This immediate pawn exchange creates a more complex middle game where coordinated piece play becomes paramount for black to exploit the newly available diagonal for the queen and the open f-file, while white must be wary of any pawn breaks black might orchestrate. Opening the e-file now offers a direct path for your rook, aiming to pressure the weak pawn on f5 and create immediate tactical possibilities. The rook now powerfully claims the open file, establishing a dynamic presence and threatening further incursions down the 7th rank, simultaneously opening a clear line for the other rook to potentially join the offensive. Reinforcing the queen side, this maneuver shores up the pawn, simultaneously eyeing the b-file for potential future pressure while offering a degree of protection against any immediate black incursions. Disrupting the pawn chain is a bold choice, potentially liberating your queenside pawns and opening a diagonal for your bishop, though it does leave the kingside slightly less defended, a trade-off you'll need to carefully monitor as the game progresses. Slamming the rook onto the 5th rank immediately challenges black's pawn structure and threatens to disrupt their coordination, particularly targeting the weak pawn on f5. Pivoting the bishop to the queenside aims to connect the rooks and potentially challenge the open c-file, but it leaves the d5 pawn somewhat exposed and creates a target for white's rook if it can swing over. Reoccupying the b1 square with the rook solidifies control over the semi-open file and prepares for potential advances on the queen side, while simultaneously discouraging any immediate black incursions along that flank. Preparing to double rooks on the c-file now looks like a logical next step for black, aiming to challenge white's control and create some counterplay along that open column. Unleashing the knight to e1 creates a quiet redistribution of forces, a subtle repositioning aiming to bolster the kingside and potentially support a central advance later. It's a flexible maneuver, offering the knight avenues to f3 for attack or d3 to reinforce the bishop's influence, while simultaneously preparing for a potential advance on the kingside with the rooks. The king's current shelter on d2 is a key consideration, and this knight's redeployment might be the initial step in tightening that defensive perimeter or preparing a more active defense of that square. Unleashing a pawn break creates a fascinating dynamic, potentially opening lines for the rook on the g-file and challenging white's central pawn structure. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure with a timely advance, white aims to prevent black's energetic pawn thrusts from further destabilizing the position and potentially opening lines toward the king. This seemingly quiet move also prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside later, should the opportunity arise, while simultaneously bolstering the central pawn chain against further encroachment. Pushing pawns forward relentlessly, black aims to create a robust pawn chain, hoping to exploit the space gained on the kingside. This aggressive pawn push, however, simultaneously weakens the light squares around the black king and potentially overextends. White must carefully consider whether to challenge this pawn advance directly or allow it to solidify and search for counterplay elsewhere, perhaps on the queen side where white currently holds a positional advantage. The immediate aftermath will likely involve a delicate dance of pawn exchanges or a strategic repositioning of forces to exploit the newly created imbalances. Initiating a knight maneuver towards the kingside, this repositioning aims to challenge black's advanced pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around white's own king. Acknowledging the imminent danger to his king, the black monarch seeks a safer haven, preparing to step away from the central pressure and the open H-file, potentially initiating a subtle defensive maneuver. Recapturing with the rook finally unblocks white's queenside pawn structure, potentially opening the B-file for future pressure. Strategic concept: restoring structural integrity and preparing for queenside operations. Action: reclaiming the central file after an exchange. Impact: opens lines for white's rooks. Theme: pawn structure and open files. A thoughtful maneuver: the rook seeks safer shores, vacating the F-file for its comrade and preparing for potential advances that might arise from the central pawn push. Positioning the rook on the open file dramatically increases its influence, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses around black's king and create pressure on the C-file. The king finds a slightly safer perch, momentarily escaping the immediate threat of the rook on the C-file, but the queenside pawn structure remains compromised and a potential target for infiltration. The knight's leap to B4 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially fork the rook and pawn. Unburdening the queen's influence allows black to finally activate that knight and challenge the center, potentially creating weaknesses on white's queenside structure if the exchange is maintained. A daring thrust to seize the initiative, this exchange gambles on disrupting black's central structure and creating attacking chances on the kingside, even if it temporarily weakens white's own king's safety. Liberating the rook from its defensive tether on the C-file, this maneuver seeks to activate it on a more central square, eyeing potential play along the third rank or even a regrouping to the queenside, though the doubled pawns remain a positional scar. Seizing control of the open file, white's rook now dominates the crucial 8th rank, creating immediate pressure on black's isolated queen's rook and potentially forcing further concessions. Unleashing a knight to C6 now actively challenges white's control over the C-file and aims to disrupt their piece's harmonious setup. This maneuver is about preventing white from consolidating their advantage on that open file and introducing some much-needed dynamism into black's position. It's a proactive step to avoid passively accepting the consequences of the recent exchanges. Unlocking the queenside with a pawn thrust, white aims to sever black's connected pawns and create lasting weaknesses. Opening the queenside, black aims to finally activate their rook on the F-file, but the cost is a glaring weakness on the newly opened B pawn, a prime target for white's advancing pieces. Unleashing the rook to attack the enemy king, the white monarch finds itself in a precarious position, demanding immediate attention. Protecting the king against the advancing rook and bishop pair, the monarch retreats to a more secluded square, aiming to survive the immediate storm while black's pawns remain dispersed and vulnerable on the queenside. Unleashing the rook onto the 7th rank immediately disrupts black's defensive structure, seizing a critical open file that promises aggressive potential and aims to exploit the exposed king. Opening the door for the knight to reclaim central influence, this retreat aims to reposition the piece for better defensive duties or a potential sortie, while acknowledging the compromised queenside pawn structure. Seizing the open diagonal with the bishop redirects attacking pressure towards black's vulnerable queenside, while simultaneously preparing for a potential rook lift to support any advance on that flank. The knight ventures forward, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps eye the weak squares around the king, though its immediate impact is limited by white's centralized bishop. Exploiting the newly opened d-file, white snatches a pawn, introducing a tangible material advantage. Black's knight, after a long journey, finally arrives at a post where it can exert maximum influence, potentially targeting white's weakened kingside or bolstering the defense of its own monarch. This daring redeployment of the rook immediately injects life into white's position, aiming to disrupt black's central control and potentially threaten the isolated pawn on the 7th rank. It's a bold play, seeking to capitalize on the slightly exposed black king by opening lines, even if it means sacrificing a pawn for positional pressure. Sacrificing material for initiative often presents a double-edged sword, and here, black gambles on creating counterplay by snatching a pawn, hoping the advanced white king becomes a target amidst the material imbalance. Liberating the queen's pawn offers a surprising counterthrust, aiming to dislodge black's powerful knight and open a path for the king to participate more actively in the game. Reclaiming a piece that was just surrendered into enemy territory demonstrates a tactical awareness, aiming to disrupt white's already established control of the d-file and potentially create counterplay. The bishop now exerts pressure along the open a2-g8 diagonal, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially support a future d6 pawn push. Seeking a vital outpost on the c5 square for the rook offers a chance to disrupt white's central control and eye the d5 pawn, but it overlooks the immediate danger to the black king from the advancing white pawns. Chasing the rogue knight across the board with the rook might seem active, but it risks scattering your forces, leaving black's monarch with fewer immediate threats to worry about and potentially allowing their pieces to regroup more effectively. The knight's leap to h4 appears to be a desperate attempt to activate a dormant piece, potentially eyeing the now exposed white king or seeking a defensive post, but it leaves the pawn structure on the kingside compromised and doesn't address the immediate pressure on the queenside. Unleashing the rook from its passive post allows the king to sidestep potential discovered threats and prepares for a more active role in the latter stages of the game, aiming to exploit the open files and the awkwardly placed black knight. The knight retreats to its starting square, a seemingly passive repositioning, yet it clears the f-file for the rook and prepares a potential outpost on e3 if white's king ventures too far from its pawn cover. Unleashing a decisive check, white forces the black king to a more exposed position, amplifying its vulnerability along the open diagonals and files. The black monarch, now unchained from its protective pawn shield, ventures into the open field, seeking fresh pastures of safety. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential, the advance of the d-pawn here aims to create an unstoppable force, pushing the black king further back and potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces. This pawn, now protected by the rook and king, demands black's immediate attention, forcing a defensive posture and restricting their attacking options. Bringing the rook back to the 7th rank reestablishes a crucial defensive shield, preventing white's king from venturing further up the board and offering some respite for the beleaguered pawns. Unleashing the rook to its 7th rank aggressively pressures the pinned knight and creates a formidable barrier, aiming to simplify the position by forcing exchanges and advancing towards a decisive pawn endgame where white's king can become an active participant.